For nearly 200 years, one of the oldest civilizations in the world was ruled by a distant island thousands of miles away. Empires rose and fell on Indian soil. But none reshaped the land as deeply as British rule. From traders to rulers, from commerce to control, Britain transformed India in ways that still echo today. This is the story of British rule in India. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for taking the time to explore history together. Today's story follows the long and complex period when Britain ruled India. It is a story of ambition and strategy, of power and resistance, and of a land forever changed by empire. British rule did not arrive overnight. It grew slowly, through trade, war, and administration, until it shaped every corner of the subcontinent. Before we begin, consider this question. Did British rule in India bring progress through order and reform, or did it cause lasting damage through exploitation and control? Share your thoughts, and let us begin. At the dawn of the 17th century, the seas were becoming highways of ambition. European powers looked eastward, drawn by stories of immense wealth carried in spices, silks, and fine cotton. In the year 1600, England joined this race by granting a charter to a new commercial venture. This organization would soon be known as the British East India Company, and its purpose was clear and limited. It existed to trade, to negotiate, and to profit, not to rule. The first British ships that sailed toward India carried merchants rather than soldiers. Their holds were filled with silver and expectations. And their crews were guided by fragile maps and uncertain winds. After long and dangerous voyages, they reached ports that had thrived for centuries. Within vast and sophisticated trading networks, India was not an unknown land waiting to be discovered. It was already a center of global commerce, connected to the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia. British traders arrived as guests in a world governed by powerful local rulers. The Mughal Empire dominated much of the subcontinent, overseeing cities of great wealth and cultural confidence. Regional kingdoms controlled ports and inland routes, collecting taxes and regulating trade. Any foreign merchant wishing to operate needed permission, protection, and cooperation from these authorities. Early encounters were cautious and formal. They presented gifts, negotiated terms, and learned court etiquette. They relied on translators and local intermediaries who understood both languages and customs. Trade agreements were fragile and could be withdrawn at any moment. The British depended entirely on Indian rulers for access and survival. The company established its first major foothold in Surat, a bustling port on the western coast. Surat was already crowded with traders from Arabia, Persia, and Europe. Here, British merchants rented warehouses, stored goods, and shipped textiles back to Europe. Their presence was modest, their influence limited. But the profits were promising. Further south, along the eastern coast, another trading post emerged at Madras. This was not a factory in the modern sense, but a compound where goods were stored, deals were recorded, and company agents lived under protection. Bombay entered British hands later in the century, transferred through royal marriage rather than conquest. At the time, it was a collection of islands with strategic value but limited development. The company recognized its potential as a deep harbor and began slowly expanding its facilities. Still, Bombay remained dependent on surrounding powers for supplies and security. On the eastern edge of the subcontinent, Calcutta took shape along the Hooghly River. This region was rich in textiles and agricultural produce, making it attractive for trade. British merchants built warehouses and docks, carefully navigating the political landscape of Bengal. Life inside these early trading posts followed a rhythm shaped by commerce and caution. Ships arrived with bullion and departed heavy with goods destined for European markets. Clerks recorded shipments, weighed bales of cloth, and calculated profits. Disease, climate, and distance from home added constant strain. The air was thick with unfamiliar smells, languages, and customs. The British East India Company at this stage had no army to speak of. Security was minimal, often provided by hired guards or local forces. Any serious conflict would have ended disastrously for the traders. As a result, diplomacy was essential. Maintaining good relations with Indian officials mattered more than force. Indian merchants played a central role in this early system. They supplied goods, arranged transport, and extended credit. Without their cooperation, British trade would have collapsed. Far from controlling commerce, the company was just one participant in a vast and competitive marketplace. Throughout the 17th century, Britain remained a minor player compared to established European rivals and powerful Asian empires. Portuguese, Dutch, and later French traders competed fiercely for influence. Success depended on negotiation, patience, and adaptability rather than strength. Permanent trading posts created stable points of contact. Knowledge of local politics grew. Relationships formed between company agents and regional power brokers. Over time, commercial interests began to intertwine with political concerns. Still, between 1600 and 1600, conquest was not the goal. The British came to buy and sell, to ship goods across oceans, and to return home with profit. They paid taxes, followed rules, and accepted the authority of Indian rulers. The idea that a trading company might one day govern vast territories would have seemed improbable. As the century drew to a close, British involvement in India remained limited but persistent. Warehouses stood along busy ports, ships continued their long journeys, and ledgers recorded growing profits. Power still rested firmly with local empires, and the British presence depended on their consent. The arrival of British traders did not yet signal empire. It marked the opening of a long relationship shaped first by trade, and only much later by power. By the early years of the 18th century, the Mughal Empire still appeared vast on the map. But its strength was no longer what it had once been. The memory of powerful emperors and unified rule lingered. Yet the reality on the ground told a different story. Authority weakened at the center. And the balance that had held the empire together began to loosen. After the death of strong rulers in the late 17th century, the imperial court struggled to maintain control over distant provinces. Succession disputes drained energy and resources. Court politics became increasingly complex, marked by rivalry and mistrust. Decisions were delayed, commands were contested. And the confidence that once defined Mughal authority slowly faded. Across the subcontinent, regional governors and military leaders sensed this change. Many had long managed their territories with relative independence, but now they began to act more openly in their own interests. The empire was no longer a single, unified force, but a collection of competing powers. Political unity declined not through one sudden collapse, but through steady fragmentation. The imperial army, once disciplined and formidable, suffered from poor funding and divided leadership. Soldiers were paid irregularly. Loyalty weakened. Commanders often answered more to regional interests than to the emperor in Delhi. At the same time, new pressures emerged from beyond India's shores. European trading companies had been present for decades, operating under imperial permission. They built factories, negotiated trade privileges, and paid duties to local authorities. Their role was commercial, and they relied on diplomacy to protect their interests. As Mughal authority weakened, this balance began to change. Disputes between regional rulers created instability along trade routes and coastal regions. Merchants faced threats from local conflicts, shifting taxes, and unreliable protection. European companies, driven by profit and competition, sought ways to secure their operations more directly. The British East India Company moved cautiously but decisively. It observed the changing political landscape and adapted. Where diplomacy once ensured safety, it now seemed insufficient. The company began to organize armed guards, initially to protect warehouses and shipping. These forces were small, but their presence marked an important shift. Throughout the early 1700s, military power slowly replaced negotiation as the primary means of influence. European companies learned to play regional rivals against one another, offering support in exchange for privileges. In return, they gained land, trading rights, and exemptions from certain controls. Each agreement weakened imperial authority further, even if unintentionally. The Mughal court attempted to respond, but its reach was limited. Revenue declined as regions withheld funds or redirected them to local armies. Without consistent income, the empire could not reform its military or administration effectively. Efforts to reassert control often came too late, or were undermined by internal division. For ordinary people, this period was marked by uncertainty. Borders shifted. Taxes changed hands. Allegiances were unclear. Markets remained active, but the sense of overarching order diminished. Authority was now something negotiated locally, rather than imposed from the center. European powers exploited this uncertainty with growing confidence. Fortifications were strengthened. Trade settlements began to resemble small, self-governed enclaves. The British East India Company, in particular, invested heavily in military organization. It recruited locally, trained soldiers, and established command structures that operated independently of Mughal oversight. These forces were justified as defensive, yet they allowed the company to intervene in regional disputes when it suited commercial goals. By the 1730s and 1740s, the Mughal emperor remained a symbol of legitimacy, but real power lay elsewhere. Regional states negotiated directly with European companies. Treaties were signed without imperial approval. Military power had become the new language of politics. Diplomacy still existed, but it was backed by force. Agreements were enforced not by imperial decree, but by armed presence. The idea of a single authority governing the subcontinent had become more tradition than reality. This transformation reshaped the future of the region in ways that were not yet fully visible. The decline of Mughal power between 1700 and 1750 was not simply a story of failure. It was a complex process shaped by internal strain, regional ambition, and external pressure. The empire did not vanish overnight. It receded slowly, leaving space for new powers to rise. In that space, European companies found opportunity. Their growing armies were a response to instability, but also a cause of further change. Trade and warfare became increasingly intertwined. Commercial interests demanded protection, and protection required force. By the middle of the 18th century, the foundations of a new order were in place. The Mughal Empire still existed, but its authority had been deeply eroded. Regional rulers acted independently, and European powers stood ready to expand their role. The shift from diplomacy to military power marked the end of one era and the quiet beginning of another. The decline of Mughal authority did not only reshape India's past. It set the stage for forces that would soon redefine its future. In the middle of the 18th century, Bengal stood as one of the richest regions in the world. Its rivers carried trade, its fields produced wealth, and its courts controlled immense resources. European merchants had come seeking profit, not power. They built trading posts, negotiated permissions, and relied on local rulers for protection. At this moment, few could imagine that a single battle would transform commerce into conquest. By 1757, tensions had been rising steadily. The East India Company had grown from a group of traders into a private force with soldiers, forts, and ambition. Its leaders feared the loss of privileges and influence, while the ruler of Bengal viewed the company with increasing suspicion. Diplomacy failed, trust collapsed, and both sides prepared for confrontation. The decisive encounter took place near the village of Plassey. The battlefield itself was unremarkable, a flat stretch of land beside a river, bordered by mango groves. Yet what happened there would echo across centuries. On one side stood the army of Bengal, vast in number and confident in strength. On the other stood a much smaller British force, disciplined, well-drilled, and guided by careful planning. The imbalance in numbers suggested an easy victory for Bengal. But the battle was never only about soldiers and weapons. Behind the lines, secret agreements had already been made. Key figures within the Bengal court had lost faith in their ruler. Promises of reward and power tempted them to withhold support at the crucial moment. Loyalty, the foundation of any army, had quietly eroded. As the battle began, confusion spread through the ranks. Heavy rain soaked the field, misfires occurred. And hesitation replaced confidence. Sections of the Bengal army remained strangely inactive, waiting instead of advancing. British forces, sensing opportunity, held their ground and responded with precision. What should have been a swift defeat turned into a slow unraveling. The outcome was decided less by force than by betrayal. Allies who had pledged support failed to act. Orders were questioned, movements delayed, and unity dissolved. By the end of the day, the ruler of Bengal fled the field. And British victory was assured. The Battle of Plassey was over. But its consequences were only beginning. This victory was not merely military. It was political, financial, and psychological. Through the aftermath of Plassey, the East India Company gained control over Bengala's revenues. Wealth that once filled local treasuries now flowed into company hands. With money came power, and with power came ambition far beyond trade. Plassey marked a turning point where merchants began to rule. The company no longer depended on permission alone. It could raise armies, influence successions, and dictate terms. Indian politics became intertwined with corporate interests, and decisions were increasingly shaped by profit rather than governance. For the people of Bengal, the change was subtle at first. Local institutions remained, rulers still sat on thrones, and traditional authority appeared intact. Yet behind the scenes, real control had shifted. Revenue systems were reorganized, alliances restructured, and resistance weakened through division. What looked like continuity was in fact the beginning of transformation. The success at Plassey sent a powerful message. It demonstrated that European forces could defeat much larger Indian armies through strategy and manipulation. Other regional powers took notice, some seeking alliances, others preparing defenses. The balance of power across the subcontinent began to tilt. Within the company, confidence surged. Plassey became proof that military force could secure commercial dominance. Future campaigns were planned with greater boldness. Each victory expanded influence, and each treaty tightened control. It showed that conquest did not always require overwhelming strength. It could be achieved through negotiation, betrayal, and careful exploitation of internal divisions. This method would be repeated again and again as British influence spread. Plassey did not immediately create an empire, but it opened the door. From that moment, British political control in India was no longer a distant possibility. It was an unfolding reality. Over the following decades, company authority expanded from Bengal into neighboring regions, often justified as protection or reform. The transformation from trade to rule reshaped India's future. Economic priorities replaced local needs. Decisions affecting millions were made by distant directors and officials. What began as a commercial enterprise evolved into a system of governance backed by force. Looking back, the Battle of Plassey stands as a quiet but decisive moment. It lacked the scale of later wars, yet its impact was far greater. A single day on a muddy field altered the course of history. It marked the moment when commerce crossed the line into control. From Plassey onward, British presence in India was no longer temporary or limited. It was foundational. The path toward empire had been set, not through overwhelming victory, but through calculated alliances and broken trust. The echoes of that turning point would shape generations to come. Trade had transformed into rule, and a new chapter of history had begun, one defined by power gained not only through battle, but through the subtle art of influence and division. In 1765, a turning point quietly reshaped the future of the Indian subcontinent. The East India Company, once a trading enterprise on distant shores, gained the right to collect revenue in Bengal. Taxes, once paid to local rulers, now flowed into company hands. Revenue became the foundation of control. Money collected from fields, markets, and towns funded soldiers, fortifications, and administration. What had begun as trade posts along the coast evolved into a governing system rooted in finance. The company no longer depended solely on Britain for resources. India itself now paid for its own conquest. Bengal was only the beginning. With revenue secured, the company expanded its armies. Indian soldiers were recruited, trained, and paid from local taxation. European officers commanded, but Indian manpower filled the ranks. Military strength grew steadily, backed by predictable income. Power expanded through both force and agreement. Some territories fell after hard campaigns. Others were absorbed through treaties that promised protection while stripping real authority. Local rulers, facing company armies and diplomatic pressure, often had little choice. Each new agreement extended company influence without the need for full annexation. Resistance did not disappear quietly. In southern India, Mysore stood as a formidable challenge. Its rulers modernized their forces and resisted company expansion for decades. Several wars followed, each more decisive than the last. By the end of the 18th century, Mysorea's resistance was broken, and its lands absorbed. To the west and center of the subcontinent, the Maratha Confederacy posed an even greater obstacle. It controlled vast territories and commanded large armies. Conflict with the company unfolded over multiple campaigns. Battles were fought across plains and forts, draining resources on both sides. The company adapted its strategy. Instead of total confrontation, it combined warfare with selective alliances. Maratha divisions were isolated, defeated, or persuaded to accept treaties. By the early 19th century, Maratha power was shattered. What remained was a network of company-controlled states. By 1800, the map of India had changed dramatically. Large regions were now under direct company administration. Others were ruled by princes who governed in name only. Company residents advised, supervised, and often dictated policy. Administration expanded alongside conquest. Courts were established, records standardized, and revenue systems enforced. British officials replaced older structures with new bureaucratic models. These systems prioritized efficiency and predictability over local custom. Control depended on paperwork as much as soldiers. Economic policy followed imperial needs. India's economy was reshaped to serve British interests. Raw materials flowed outward, while finished goods flowed in. Local industries that once supplied regional markets struggled to compete. Traditional manufacturing centers declined as imported goods gained dominance. Textiles, once a source of global demand, were especially affected. Skilled artisans found fewer buyers for their work. Many were pushed toward agriculture or low-paid labor. Wealth extracted through taxation and trade enriched Britain while local economies weakened. The imbalance became structural, not temporary. Revenue demands remained high. Tax collection was rigid, often ignoring local hardship. When harvests failed, payments were still expected. The burden fell heaviest on peasants and rural communities. Economic stress became a constant feature of company rule. Despite this, the company maintained order through military presence. Indian soldiers guarded roads, escorted officials, and suppressed unrest. Their loyalty was tied to pay and discipline rather than political power. They became the silent enforcers of an expanding system. Over time, company authority began to feel permanent. Generations grew up knowing no other ruler. British law, education, and administration spread steadily. Yet beneath the surface, dissatisfaction grew. Economic pressure and political exclusion created quiet resentment. By the mid-19th century, company rule covered most of India. What had started in 1765 as a financial arrangement had become an empire. The company controlled armies, courts, and treasuries. It governed millions with a structure designed for profit. The expansion between 1765 and 1857 reshaped India's destiny. The company stood at the center of this transformation. Rule based on extraction required constant enforcement. The army grew larger, administration more intrusive, and demands more rigid. By 1857, the weight of company rule had reached a breaking point. The foundations laid in these decades would not disappear. They shaped the later empire that followed. But the era of company rule was defined by this expansion. From revenue rights in Bengal to dominance across India, the company built power through finance, force, and control. This was not just the story of conquest. It was the story of how money became authority, and authority became empire. Life under company rule unfolded quietly at first, almost unnoticed by those who lived within it. Authority arrived not with crowns or armies alone, but with paperwork, contracts, and new laws written in unfamiliar language. British laws began to reshape Indian society in deliberate ways. Legal systems were standardized, replacing regional practices with uniform codes. These changes promised order and predictability, yet they often ignored the rhythms of local life. Justice became something administered, not shared. Courts spoke with authority, but rarely with understanding. One of the most profound changes came through land revenue systems. Fields that had sustained families for generations were reclassified, measured, and taxed under new rules. Land was no longer simply a source of livelihood. It became an asset to be recorded, assessed, and extracted from. Revenue targets were fixed, indifferent to harvest conditions or weather. For peasants, this shift altered everyday existence. Taxes had to be paid on time and in cash. Failure carried consequences. Debt spread quietly through rural communities. Farmers who once relied on shared systems of support found themselves isolated, responsible for meeting demands set beyond their control. The system did not pause for drought or flood. When crops failed, obligations remained. Food stores emptied. Livestock was sold. Land changed hands. Famines became more frequent and more devastating. Hunger spread not only because of natural causes, but because relief systems were slow and limited. Grain moved along trade routes, often bypassing those who needed it most. Villages weakened gradually, then suddenly. The silence of empty fields spoke louder than official reports. In towns and cities, change took a different form. New institutions appeared. Schools taught modern subjects. Courts introduced new procedures. Roads and offices expanded administrative reach. These reforms carried promise, suggesting progress and improvement. Yet access remained narrow. Education was limited to small sections of society. Opportunity was selective. Legal reforms aimed to create fairness, but they also reinforced distance. Laws were applied uniformly, but without equal voice. Indian participation in decision-making was minimal. Policies were implemented from above, shaped by priorities that rarely aligned with local needs. Inclusion was discussed, but rarely practiced. The company governed through layers of intermediaries. Officials collected revenue, enforced law, and maintained order. Many were efficient. Some were indifferent. A few were harsh. The system valued stability over empathy. Its success was measured in figures, not in well-being. The lived experience of ordinary people remained secondary. Traditional authorities lost influence. Village leaders found their roles reduced. Customary practices were overridden by regulation. Literacy in the language of administration became a form of currency, opening doors closed to others. Indian voices were largely excluded from power. Advisory roles existed, but real authority rested elsewhere. Decisions affecting millions were made by a small group, guided by economic and strategic goals. Consultation was limited. Consent was assumed rather than sought. This absence shaped the character of rule. Yet life continued within these constraints. Families adapted. Communities supported one another where possible. Markets adjusted. Clerks, teachers, and intermediaries found roles within the system. For a few, company rule offered advancement. For many more, it brought uncertainty. Cultural life persisted alongside control. Festivals were celebrated. Traditions endured. Songs and stories carried memory and meaning. These elements provided continuity in a time of disruption. While structures changed, identity remained rooted in shared experience. Over time, awareness grew. People began to recognize patterns in policy and outcome. Heavy taxation, limited representation, and recurring hardship formed a connected story. Discontent did not always erupt, but it settled quietly, shaping attitudes and expectations. The distance between ruler and ruled became clearer. Life under company rule was not defined by a single moment, but by accumulation. Each law, each tax, each reform layered upon the last. The impact was uneven, felt differently across regions and classes. Yet the overall direction was consistent. Control expanded. Local autonomy contracted. The company presented itself as orderly and rational. It recorded, categorized, and planned. But beneath this surface lay complexity and cost. Its benefits were concentrated. Its burdens were widespread. The promise of reform remained partial, limited by design and intent. Education and law existed, but power did not flow with them. Life under company rule was a period of transition marked by tension between change and continuity. It altered how land was owned, how justice was delivered, and how authority was understood. It left behind roads, records, and institutions, but also deep scars in rural life and social trust. This era set the stage for what followed. The systems introduced would shape future governance, resistance, and reform. The experiences of ordinary people during this time became part of a larger story, one of endurance under pressure and adaptation amid imbalance. In remembering life under company rule, the focus is not only on policy, but on people. On families navigating new laws without a voice in making them. On a society reshaped quietly, profoundly, and unevenly by distant power. In the year 1857, a deep and long-building tension finally broke. Across northern India, unrest turned into open rebellion, shaking the foundations of British rule. What began as scattered acts of resistance soon grew into a widespread uprising that involved soldiers, civilians, princes, and peasants. The revolt did not emerge from a single cause. It was the result of decades of change, pressure, and resentment under foreign control. By the mid-19th century, the British East India Company governed vast territories. Its power rested heavily on the Indian Army, made up largely of Indian soldiers known as sepoys. These men had served the company for generations, fighting its wars and enforcing its authority. Yet beneath the surface of discipline and loyalty, dissatisfaction was growing. Reforms introduced by the company touched every part of Indian life. Land systems disrupted traditional ownership. Local rulers were removed or sidelined. Laws and courts replaced long-standing customs. For many, these changes felt sudden and imposed, eroding familiar structures that had shaped society for centuries. Within the army, tensions sharpened. New regulations challenged religious practices and personal beliefs. Rumors spread quickly through cantonments and bazaars, feeding fear and suspicion. Trust between British officers and Indian soldiers weakened, creating an atmosphere charged with uncertainty. In the spring of 1857, this fragile balance collapsed. Acts of defiance by sepoys escalated into mutiny. Soldiers refused orders, attacked symbols of company authority, and called for wider resistance. The spark ignited a fire that spread rapidly across northern India. Cities and towns became centers of rebellion. Civilians joined soldiers, driven by anger, hope, or desperation. Old grievances resurfaced as people challenged British officials and institutions. In some places, local leaders stepped forward, seeing an opportunity to reclaim lost power or defend traditional rule. The uprising was not a single coordinated movement. It varied from region to region, shaped by local conditions and ambitions. Some areas saw intense fighting, while others experienced brief uprisings before order was restored. Still, the scale of the revolt stunned British authorities, who had believed their control was secure. British forces responded with determination and urgency. Reinforcements were rushed in from across the empire. Loyal units were reorganized, supply lines secured, and key cities targeted for recapture. The struggle was prolonged and bitter, marked by sieges, counterattacks, and harsh reprisals. By 1858, the rebellion had been largely crushed. British military power reasserted itself through superior resources and coordination. Resistance collapsed one stronghold after another. The cost was immense. Communities were left scarred, and trust between rulers and ruled was deeply damaged. The revolt had shaken British confidence, and the response was shaped by fear as much as authority. The events of 1857 forced Britain to confront the failures of company rule. The uprising revealed how fragile its system had become and how deeply resentment had spread. It was clear that a commercial organization was no longer capable of governing such a vast and complex land. Control passed directly to the British Crown, marking a profound shift in governance. India was now administered as an imperial possession rather than a corporate enterprise. The army was reorganized. Recruitment policies changed, and greater caution was exercised in managing religious and cultural practices. British authorities sought to prevent another uprising by reshaping military and administrative structures. Yet the memory of 1857 lingered, influencing every decision that followed. For Indians, the revolt became a symbol of resistance and sacrifice. Though it failed to expel British rule, it demonstrated the possibility of collective action against a powerful empire. Stories of courage and loss passed through generations, shaping political thought and national consciousness. The revolt of 1857 stands as a turning point. It ended company rule and ushered in a new phase of imperial control. It revealed the limits of power built on coercion and misunderstanding. Most of all, it exposed the deep fractures within colonial rule that could no longer be ignored. Between rebellion and repression, hope and defeat. The uprising left a lasting mark on Indian history. It was not the end of resistance, but the beginning of a new and more complex struggle. The echoes of 1857 would continue to shape the relationship between India and Britain for decades to come. In 1858, a profound shift took place across the Indian subcontinent. The rule of the East India Company came to an end, and authority passed directly to the British Crown. This change followed years of tension and conflict, and it marked the beginning of a new phase in imperial governance. Power that had once been exercised by a commercial enterprise was now claimed openly by the British state. The transfer of control was presented as a fresh start. A centralized administration was introduced, designed to bring order, consistency, and efficiency to governance. Decisions were no longer filtered through company interests alone. Instead, they flowed from London through a carefully structured hierarchy of officials. Governors, civil servants, and administrators formed a system intended to manage a vast and diverse land from a single imperial center. Across India, the symbols of authority became more visible and more formal. Government buildings rose in major cities. Legal codes were standardized. Administrative districts were clearly defined. The language of rule emphasized stability and permanence, suggesting that British authority was no longer temporary or experimental, but firmly established. Infrastructure played a crucial role in this transformation. Railways expanded rapidly, cutting across plains, forests, and hills. Iron tracks linked ports to inland cities, and cities to remote regions. What once took weeks by road or river could now be reached in days. These railways moved troops, officials, and goods with unprecedented speed, binding the subcontinent more tightly to imperial control. Alongside the railways came the telegraph. Thin wires stretched across vast distances, carrying messages faster than any rider or ship. Orders could be sent instantly. Reports returned just as quickly. For the first time, events in distant provinces could be monitored almost in real time. This technology reshaped governance, reducing the independence of local authorities and strengthening centralized oversight. British officials viewed these developments as signs of progress. They spoke of modernization and efficiency. They believed that infrastructure and administration would bring order to a land they considered fragmented. Yet this order was designed to serve imperial priorities. Economic extraction, strategic security, and political control guided decisions at every level. By the 1870s, British authority reached a symbolic peak. In 1876, Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India. The announcement was rich with ceremony and meaning. It signaled that India was not merely a possession, but a central pillar of the British Empire. The title reinforced the idea of a direct and personal bond between the crown and its Indian subjects. Grand events and proclamations followed. Durbar ceremonies displayed imperial splendor, blending British pageantry with selected elements of Indian tradition. These spectacles were meant to inspire loyalty and awe. They projected confidence, suggesting that British rule was both powerful and benevolent. Yet beneath the surface, political freedom remained absent. Indians had little say in how they were governed. Key decisions were made by British officials, often far removed from the realities of local life. Advisory councils existed, but their influence was limited. Representation was narrow and carefully controlled. The centralized system prioritized order over participation. Laws were enforced uniformly, but they were not shaped by those most affected by them. Taxation policies supported imperial needs. Land settlements redefined ownership and revenue collection, sometimes disrupting long-standing social arrangements. Stability was achieved, but at a cost. The army remained a critical instrument of control. Though largely composed of Indian soldiers, it was directed by British officers and loyal to the Crown. Garrisons were positioned along railway lines and near strategic centres. The presence of troops reinforced the authority of the state and deterred resistance. Education policies reflected similar contradictions. Schools and universities were established, producing a growing class of educated Indians. They learned administrative skills, law, and the English language. This education created new opportunities. But it also introduced ideas about rights, governance, and equality. That went beyond what the imperial system was prepared to grant. As the 19th century drew toward its end, British India appeared stable and firmly governed. Trade expanded. Infrastructure connected distant regions. Administration functioned with precision. From the imperial perspective, the crown had succeeded in imposing order over a vast territory. But this stability was not the same as consent. Many Indians experienced British rule as distant and unresponsive. Cultural differences, racial hierarchies, and exclusion from power shaped everyday interactions. Respect was demanded, but equality was not offered. The contradiction at the heart of Crown rule became increasingly clear. British authority had reached its height, supported by technology, military strength, and centralized administration. Yet the absence of political freedom meant that this authority rested on control rather than partnership. Between 1858 and 1900, India was transformed administratively and physically. Railways and telegraphs shrank distances. The British Crown established itself as the unquestioned ruler of the subcontinent. At the same time, these very changes laid the groundwork for future challenges. Education, communication, and shared experience began to connect people in new ways. Awareness grew, slowly and unevenly, across regions and communities. The era of direct Crown rule was one of confidence and consolidation. It marked the peak of British power in India. Yet beneath the appearance of order and grandeur lay unresolved questions about authority, representation, and freedom. The systems built to control India had also created the conditions for new expectations. The British Crown had taken control, but the story of how that control would be questioned had already begun. At the dawn of the 20th century, the political atmosphere of India began to change in quiet but unmistakable ways. For decades, British rule had appeared solid and permanent, supported by administration, law, and military power. Yet beneath this surface, a new awareness was taking shape. Educated Indians, professionals, students, and workers were beginning to question not only how they were governed, but why foreign rule should continue at all. Nationalism did not emerge suddenly. It grew slowly through meetings, newspapers, and conversations. In classrooms and public halls, political organizations expanded their reach, drawing supporters from different regions and communities. Their early demands were cautious, focused on reforms rather than revolution. They asked for greater participation in government, fairer laws, and respect for Indian voices within the system. As these demands spread, public protest became more visible. Peaceful demonstrations, petitions, and organized campaigns appeared in cities and towns. Symbols of unity and identity gained meaning. What had once been isolated grievances began to feel connected, forming a broader movement that challenged the moral authority of empire. British authorities responded with uncertainty. At times, they attempted limited concessions, offering reforms designed to calm unrest without surrendering control. New councils and advisory roles were introduced, but real power remained firmly in British hands. These gestures satisfied few and often raised expectations that could not be met. When protests intensified, repression followed. Laws were tightened, gatherings restricted, and activists monitored. Arrests and censorship became tools of control. This alternating pattern of concession and crackdown created deep frustration. Each promise of reform followed by restraint weakened trust further. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 marked a turning point. India was drawn into the conflict without choice, providing soldiers, resources, and labor for a distant war. Hundreds of thousands served overseas, fighting in unfamiliar lands under imperial command. Their service was framed as loyalty, but it also carried expectation. Many Indians believed that sacrifice during the war would lead to meaningful political change afterward. Speeches and statements from British leaders hinted at progress and partnership. These words spread hope, even as the realities of war brought hardship at home. Prices rose, resources grew scarce, and families waited anxiously for news from the front. When the war ended in 1918, disappointment followed quickly. Promised reforms arrived slowly and fell far short of expectations. Instead of trust, new laws expanded state power and limited civil freedoms. The sense of betrayal deepened dissatisfaction and hardened attitudes across the political landscape. The years that followed saw nationalism take on a broader and more emotional character. Movements reached beyond elite circles into villages and working communities. Public participation increased, and politics became part of everyday life. It was about dignity, identity, and self-determination. British responses remained divided. Some officials recognized that change was inevitable and urged gradual transition. Others believed firm control was the only path to stability. This lack of unity within the ruling system added to uncertainty. Policies shifted, strategies changed, and confidence eroded on both sides. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, cycles of protest and repression continued. Periods of mass movement were followed by arrests and restrictions. Dialogues were opened, then closed. Each confrontation left behind a deeper awareness of collective strength and shared purpose among Indians. Economic pressures added to political strain. The global depression affected trade, employment, and rural livelihoods. Hardship sharpened anger toward colonial policies that seemed distant and unresponsive. Nationalism became not just a political stance, but a response to daily struggle. By the late 1930s, British authority in India was increasingly fragile. While the structures of rule remained intact, their legitimacy was openly questioned. Political organizations had grown stronger, more organized, and more confident. They spoke not only of reform, but of independence as a realistic goal. As the world moved once again toward war, India stood at a crossroads. The lessons of World War I were fresh, and expectations were no longer easily managed. The empire faced a population that had learned to mobilize, to resist, and to imagine a future beyond foreign rule. The period from 1900 to 1939 transformed Indian politics forever. What began as cautious demands evolved into mass nationalism. Resistance took many forms, shaped by hope, disappointment, and determination. British rule survived these decades, but it was fundamentally weakened. By the end of the 1930s, it was clear that the old methods of control could not last indefinitely. Nationalism had become a powerful force, rooted in experience and sustained by collective memory. The struggle had not yet reached its conclusion, but its direction was set. The years ahead would bring another global conflict and another test of empire. But the foundations of resistance had already been laid. India was no longer silent, no longer passive, and no longer willing to accept a future decided elsewhere. In 1939, as war spread across Europe, India was drawn into a global conflict not by choice, but by imperial decision. The declaration of war echoed across the subcontinent, carrying consequences far beyond distant battlefields. India became a vital part of the Allied war effort, even as its own future remained uncertain. Factories increased production, railways worked without pause, and ports filled with military cargo. Indian resources, labor, and industry were mobilized at an unprecedented scale. Millions of Indians contributed in different ways. Soldiers enlisted in vast numbers, forming one of the largest volunteer forces in history. They served in deserts, jungles, mountains, and coastal regions far from home. Others supported the war through agriculture, manufacturing, and transport. The war effort reached into every corner of society. The subcontinent became a logistical backbone of the British war machine. Yet participation came with strain. The cost of sustaining a global war placed enormous pressure on the economy. Prices rose, shortages appeared, and daily life grew more difficult. Resources were redirected toward military needs, often at the expense of civilian welfare. The burden was felt most strongly by ordinary people. Political tension intensified as the war continued. Indian leaders questioned why a nation denied self-rule was committed to fight for freedom elsewhere. Demands for greater autonomy grew louder. The contradiction between imperial authority and democratic ideals became increasingly difficult to ignore. As the war dragged on, unrest simmered beneath the surface. Strikes, protests, and political movements gained momentum. The gap between ruler and ruled widened with each passing year. By 1945, the war had reached its conclusion. Victory came at a tremendous cost. Britain emerged exhausted, economically weakened, and deeply indebted. Its global position had changed forever. The war had transformed perceptions of power. India had demonstrated its importance on the world stage. Its soldiers had fought with discipline and courage across multiple fronts. Its industries had supported one of the largest conflicts in history. The idea that India could not govern itself no longer held credibility. Within Britain, attitudes shifted as well. Public support for empire declined. Rebuilding at home became the priority. Maintaining control over distant territories appeared increasingly impractical. The cost of rule now outweighed its benefits. In India, expectations rose rapidly after the war. Sacrifice had been made, and recognition was demanded. Political negotiations, once delayed by conflict, could no longer be postponed. The future of British rule entered its final phase. Talks between British officials and Indian leaders began in earnest. The focus moved from reform to transfer of power. What had seemed impossible before the war now appeared inevitable. The army played a quiet but significant role in this transition. Indian soldiers had proven their capability during the conflict. Their loyalty was no longer assumed to be permanent under imperial command. British leaders understood that continued rule depended on consent that was rapidly fading. Economic realities reinforced political decisions. Britain faced shortages, debt, and reconstruction challenges. India required investment, stability, and self-direction. The old imperial relationship could no longer function in the same way. Between 1945 and 1947, momentum toward independence accelerated. Administrative preparations began. Institutions were reviewed, responsibilities identified, and plans set in motion. The empire was not collapsing suddenly. It was being dismantled through negotiation and necessity. For ordinary Indians, the period was filled with anticipation and uncertainty. The promise of freedom carried hope, but also questions. Decades of colonial rule had shaped governance, economy, and society. The transition ahead would be complex and demanding. By 1947, the decision was final. Britain would withdraw from India. The war that began in 1939 had set this outcome in motion. It ended empire at home. It revealed the strength and contribution of colonized peoples. It accelerated political change that could no longer be controlled. India's path to independence was shaped by global war as much as national struggle. The end of empire did not arrive with a single announcement. It emerged from years of pressure, sacrifice, and transformation. From the first mobilization in 1939 to the final negotiations after 1945, the connection was clear. World War II had changed everything. When independence finally came, it marked more than political separation. It signaled the closing chapter of a long imperial story. The war had drained Britannia's strength and awakened India's determination. Together, these forces made continued rule impossible. The years between 1939 and 1947 stand as a turning point. A global conflict reshaped nations and ended empires. For India, the road to freedom passed through the fires of World War. In 1947, the long chapter of British rule in the Indian subcontinent came to an end. The departure was swift, formal, and final. Authority transferred on paper and in ceremony. Yet beneath these controlled movements, the land stood on the edge of profound change. Independence arrived with celebration and relief. For millions, it marked the end of foreign rule and the promise of self-determination. Dreams of freedom took shape in speeches, songs, and quiet prayers. A new future seemed possible, shaped by national will rather than imperial command. But independence did not come alone. Partition divided the land into separate nations, drawing borders across regions, villages, and lives. Lines were drawn quickly, often without full knowledge of the human landscape they crossed. Fields, rivers, and roads were split by decisions made far from the ground they altered. As the lines hardened, fear spread. Rumors moved faster than information. Trust weakened. People began to prepare for journeys they never imagined they would have to take. Violence followed the confusion. Trains became symbols of escape and danger. Roads filled with families carrying what they could hold. The scale of suffering grew rapidly, overwhelming any attempt at control. More than 1 million lives were lost during this period. Each number represented a story interrupted. Homes were abandoned. Livelihoods vanished. The human cost was immense, and it spread across borders that were still settling into place. The land absorbed grief in silence. Millions were displaced, moving across newly formed boundaries in search of safety. Camps emerged almost overnight, crowded and temporary. Aid was limited. Exhaustion was widespread. People waited for news, for direction, for reassurance that life could be rebuilt somewhere else. Amid this turmoil, institutions struggled to respond. New governments faced challenges beyond preparation. Administration had to be built while crisis unfolded. Security forces were stretched thin. The priority became survival and stability, often at the expense of long-term planning. The structures it left behind were not designed for sudden division. The haste of withdrawal added strain to an already fragile moment. The legacy of rule became inseparable from the consequences of its end. For many, the memory of independence is forever linked with loss. Celebration and mourning exist together in the same moment of history. Freedom was achieved, but at a price that reshaped families and communities across the region. Yet even in this darkness, resilience emerged. People rebuilt lives from fragments. New neighborhoods formed. Traditions adapted. The act of starting again became a quiet form of courage. Across borders, shared experiences of displacement created new identities rooted in survival. The new nations faced the task of defining themselves. Constitutions were written. Borders defended. Institutions formed. The past remained present, influencing choices and tensions. Independence required not only freedom from rule, but responsibility for direction. Partition left lasting questions. About belonging. About borders. About memory. The wounds did not heal quickly, and for some they never fully closed. Stories were passed down through generations, shaping how history was understood and felt. The end of empire was not a single event, but a process that continued long after 1947. Its effects rippled through politics, society, and personal lives. The departure marked a transition, not a conclusion. In remembering this period, it is important to hold complexity. Independence was real and transformative. Partition was devastating and enduring. Both shaped the modern landscape in ways that cannot be separated. The legacy left behind is layered. It includes the achievement of self-rule and the trauma of division. It carries pride and pain together. History does not offer simple endings, only passages from one reality to another. Independence and partition stand as one moment in time, bound together by consequence. The empire departed, leaving behind nations to define their futures. What followed was not just the birth of states, but the reshaping of lives on a scale that still echoes across the region. British rule in India reshaped history through power, policy, and resistance. It brought railways and administration, but also exploitation and division. Understanding this past helps us understand the present. Thank you for listening and for walking through history with care. May knowledge of the past guide wiser choices for the future. Until next time, take care, and stay curious.